Hello, everyone. Thank you for checking out my YouTube channel today, The Study of Antiquity and the Middle Ages. I am your host, as always, Nick Barksdale, and today we are joined once again by Robin Reich. Robin, thank you so much for coming on the show today.
Thanks for having me.
Would you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, I'm a PhD candidate at Columbia University. So I'll have a full PhD in just about a year from now. I work on medieval Mediterranean history, history of science, and material culture studies.
That is absolutely fantastic. And just so that y'all know, I'm going to be linking a video at the end of this one, which is a talk that she did on medieval Sicily underneath Roger II. Again, it was absolutely fantastic, and I hope you enjoy it. Also, check out the links in the video description below, where it'll take you to her work on academia, her blog, and a large amount of other excellent sites that I highly encourage all of you to check out. Robin, I'm going to let you take it from here.
So today I wanted to talk a little bit about Black Death. While we're here in the US, we're all sitting around in isolation to slow the spread of coronavirus. We're seeing these inevitable comparisons to the Black Death because it represents the pinnacle of a pandemic event. And I've made some of those comparisons myself, but I think it's also important to remember how different these diseases are to keep our current experience in perspective. So I want to talk about the Black Death a bit as a social disease, how people experienced the pandemic as an event, not just as an illness. We kind of use the terms Black Death and plague interchangeably, but they're actually two different things. Plague is a really general term that can mean any really virulent infectious disease. It can mean one specific infectious disease, technically called Yersinia pestis, or it can just mean a bad society-wide event like the plagues of Egypt and the story of Passover. The Black Death is actually pretty specific. It's one single pandemic event of Yersinia pestis, which occurred in the second half of the 14th century. So what do I mean by a pandemic event? It's how we refer to the extended period of time when an infectious disease is spreading from multiple vectors without becoming part of a local ecosystem or life cycle. So think about the seasonal flu. That's an endemic disease. We expect it to appear within our communities, and even though it can be very bad, most people have some resistance to it as adults. There was a lot of anxiety around calling coronavirus a pandemic and whether the CDC or the WHO waited too long. This was a technical distinction. Infectious diseases are spread by what epidemiologists call vectors, an infected agent that carries the disease to someone or something else. In an epidemic, there's usually a single epicenter for all the vectors. We saw that early on with coronavirus, where everyone who was sick had first or second degree connections to Wuhan, China. But when people contracted coronavirus without any direct connection to Wuhan, it was a sign that there were multiple epicenters in play, and that's when it became a pandemic. So when we talk about the Black Death, we tend to think of Europe because it looms large in literature that's available in English and within the historical memory of England. So think of Chaucer, Boccaccio's Decameron, the Plague of London in 1665, and in the 20th century, Monty Python. But the Black Death really was a global event. It spread across 3 continents. There's a lot of debate among historical epidemiologists as to why the Black Death happened when it did. The dominant theory is that there was a confluence of environmental and social factors, that a brief natural warming period created a more pleasant environment for the bacterium, which was more easily able to spread among human populations in Europe because of recent poor farming yields that caused a famine and thus weaker immune systems. This is also the period when Asian steppe peoples, such as the Mongols, were moving long distances across Eurasia, and so it's possible that the plague initially moved with them. From there, Mediterranean and other long-distance trade networks, combined with newly dense cities, picked up the disease. And it's not the first time this happened with Yersinia pestis or the last. Historians typically denote 3 major pandemic events in the history of Yersinia pestis: the Justinianic plague of the 6th century, the Black Death of the 14th century, and the modern plague of the 20th century. Yes, we have had incidents of modern plague. There was a major outbreak in the late 19th into the early 20th century that spread across Asia, particularly India and Hong Kong. And that's really the period when we learned about what this disease was. There was a kind of concerted effort to figure out what was spreading it, what it was as a disease and really look at it from a more microbiological perspective. There was also plague in Vietnam when the US invaded it in the 1960s. And there's kind of a mini outbreak of plague during that period. In fact, plague is endemic among prairie dogs and other rodents in the American Southwest, and at least one case of plague is reported in the US every year when hikers stray from trails and contract the disease, usually in California or Colorado or places like that. And each of these disease events is very long. It covers multiple outbreaks over decades or even centuries. What's not included in this timeline is other famous epidemic events that we call plagues, like the plague of Athens or the biblical plagues, because historians largely believe that those had been caused by a different disease. But it's hard to tell because we don't have any human remains from those events, and written descriptions of them are often kind of theatrical and therefore somewhat unreliable. You'll notice that in all of this, I'm not calling it bubonic plague, because again, that means something very specific. Yersinia pestis has 3 typical presentations, that is, 3 ways that people get infected and show symptoms. Bubonic plague is the most recognizable, and we think historically it's been the most common. That's when the disease attacks the lymphatic system. So you get these big swelling lymph nodes. And as a result, people's skin gets blotchy and they have these lymph nodes filled with pus. And so it's very visually obvious. But the disease also had a respiratory component, which personally I think was responsible for the continued spread in Northern Europe because it could survive the winter. The disease would enter the lungs and become airborne. Finally, there's a septicemic presentation of the disease where it enters the bloodstream. From a social perspective, these different presentations are kind of confusing because they're not all visible and they're not obviously the same disease. In no case was it clear how the disease was spreading. Historians are still debating exactly how the disease moved. Don't think that you know the obvious answer was rats, because we actually don't know that for sure. What we know is that Yersinia pestis is an endemic disease for rodents, something they're susceptible to and live with regularly. But we don't actually know how it jumped from rats to humans. And certainly for the people living during the time of the Black Death in the 14th century, they don't mention rats at all. There's a modern inclination to say, oh, well, these people were so dirty that they didn't pay attention to the rats or the fleas on them. But we know that's not true. There was a lot of anxiety around cleanliness. It's just that's not how medieval peoples thought about contagion. They didn't see vectors. They didn't see individuals as contagious. The prevailing theory of contagion in the pre-modern period is the Miasma Model. So this is an idea that a disease was a social experience. It's a cloud of contagion that descends on a city. And while this model doesn't do a lot from an epidemiological perspective to track the spread of a disease from person to person, it's a very good representation of the experience of an epidemic, where you can't perceive that individual communication as it's happening. The Miasma Model helped pre-modern physicians to develop their first concepts of quarantine because it helped them identify these large patterns in the spread of the disease. So during the Justinianic plague of the 6th century and on, it actually became a standard in the Arabian Peninsula and the Eastern Mediterranean not to enter or leave a city once plague had been identified there. And this is kind of the first application of a quarantine concept. This even became codified in the Islamic tradition within the Hadith, the stories about the Prophet. And so by the time of the Black Death in the 14th century, that part of the world had already had a quarantine protocol in place. It also became a major point of pride that Medina never had the plague, as if it was the city itself that stayed healthy, not just the people within it. But just because this notion of containing the miasma existed doesn't mean people actually followed it. The elites in Syria during that first pandemic regularly fled Damascus and Aleppo during plague outbreaks. And where did they go? They built these sort of pre-modern equivalents of a country house, what we now call desert palaces. And they would sit them along the few little rivers and tributaries that used to flow through the Jordanian desert. Most of them are dry now. These were comparatively small building complexes. They're sometimes cobbled together from the remains of Roman-era buildings, and they're just lavishly painted with hunting scenes and dancing women. And of course, they had all these expected luxuries of the era, baths and various rooms for lounging. And so these wealthy families could just pick up and move their households out of the city without sacrificing any of their quality of life. We see the same thing happen in Europe during the Black Death, where wealth, but especially high status, came with owning land. And so the upper class would often retreat to their estates in the country to wait out the outbreak. But of course, this backfired more often than not because inevitably someone had already been exposed to the disease. And now, with a more limited number of hosts, the disease would just run through everyone in the estate. And also note, we're seeing the same inclination right now, and it's just as bad an idea. So stay put. The actual concept of quarantine comes from the 14th century plague. Italian trade cities pretty quickly realized that the disease was going to come to them on the ships of merchants returning from the Eastern Mediterranean, because the disease was broadly spreading east to west. And so one of the first recorded instances of quarantine is when the city of Venice mandated that a ship of Genoese merchants coming from Constantinople had to sit in the harbor for 40 days, quaranta in Italian, until it was clear that no one on board was sick. And this became the standard practice in Venice as a more stringent form of social isolation. So how did people react to all this calamity around them? As modern observers, we often like to think that medieval peoples basically became numb to it, but we have evidence that's not really true. One of the most stunning sources I've seen from this period is a medical guidebook in Arabic for bereaved parents for how to move past the death of a child from plague. On the Christian side, art historians believe that there was a massive social shift in the practice of Christianity as a result of the Black Death, based on depictions of Christ on the cross. It seems like people became a lot more fixated on the experience of suffering, and so crucifixes started to become a lot more explicit in their representations of Christ's wounds, and he started to appear not just suffering, but actually dead. There's also possibly an intensification of medical discussion as a result of the Black Death, since it highlights the flaws in the medical model of the time. I'm a bit skeptical of this, since medicine in this period doesn't really see a significant paradigm shift. It looks like it's continuing along its developmental course, but there is increasing interest in what diseases are and how they spread. It's worth remembering that germ theory, the idea that a disease is caused by a microscopic organism, didn't develop until the 19th century. So in other words, in response to Black Death, there's more focus on diseases themselves rather than how to prevent illnesses, but physicians don't really change their model of what diseases are or how they spread. There are a couple of ways that medieval peoples reacted to the Black Death that we've probably blown out of proportion. So for instance, the Flagellants, and for lack of a better term, the sort of plague partiers. These are both these roving bands of people who were supposedly driven to extremes by the prospect of the disease. The Flagellants believed that disease was a punishment for sin, and so they would publicly whip themselves. Plague partiers were trying to embrace life in the face of doom, and they played raucous music and danced. I'm not really convinced that either of these responses were such widespread movements as we think. I think they're just very evocative images. I also have to burst the bubble around plague masks. No one wore plague masks. The giant birdbeak doctor mask was invented in the 17th century after the disease had died down, and it was based on a theory of medicine that no one actually took seriously. There were plague doctors and local authorities like priests who visited the sick to try to care for them, but they probably didn't cover their faces since the medical theories didn't give them any reason to, except to protect them from the smell. So most people experience the Black Death as a calamitous but normal part of life for many years. They had to continue to feed themselves and fix their houses and all the other things that they needed to keep themselves alive. We know that life often slowed down or stopped for a time as the disease moved through. We know that people mourned and thought deeply about death and disease. But we also know that they spent time with their families and played music and thought about other things. Plague, even at its most catastrophic, didn't stop society from continuing. And for all that coronavirus is scary and horrible for the people who contract it, we're doing the right thing right now, and it won't stop us either.